San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, the shine is back on the Apple. Shares of the tech giant spike after the U.S. announces it will delay a 10% tariff on some Chinese imports, including the iPhone. Plus, more data mining. A Bloomberg scoop reveals Facebook has been paying hundreds of outside contractors to transcribe clips of audio from its users. Plus, how the social network is responding. And move over, Oprah. Sherry Redstone cements her status as the most powerful woman in U.S. media, with CBS agreeing to merge with Viacom in a long-awaited $11.7 billion deal. But first, to our top story. Shares of Apple and chipmakers soared in Tuesday trading. This after the U.S. delayed a 10% tariff on certain Chinese imports, including smartphones. Yes, that means the iPhone, as well as laptops. President Trump explained the reason for the grace period before boarding a helicopter in New Jersey, saying, quote, just in case they might have an impact on people, what we have done is delay it so they won't be relevant during the Christmas shopping season. Not just Apple, but retailers like Best Buy spiked on the news. To discuss in Washington, we've got Craig Allen, president of the U.S. China Business Council, and in L.A., Sarah McGregor, who leads Bloomberg's U.S. economic policy coverage. So, Sarah, do we have any idea what the motivation is for the change of heart?
Well, you know, we do know that, as you just said, that the news gave a bump to the stock market. We saw some retail stocks, some technology stocks go up today. And, you know, there had been some declines in share prices in recent weeks since Trump announced the tariffs. So, of course, that immediate cheer from the markets is always a win for the Trump administration. But what we don't know is what was discussed with these senior officials from China and the U.S. on their phone call. We know that the Trump administration was really waiting out for purchases by China on agricultural goods and other types of promises, really the continuation even of trade talks in September for the Chinese to come as planned. So we don't know what sort of promises were given in exchange for this delay to the tariffs. But as you said, it's about $110 billion of goods that's still going to be hit in September. And then come December, we've calculated it's about $160 billion of goods. So it's not that these tariffs aren't going to happen. It's just a bit of a staggered timeline at this point.
Right. We're also hearing that the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He had a phone conversation with U.S. Trade Rep Robert Lighthizer, as well as Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. Craig, obviously these talks have evolved in fits and starts, one step forward, two steps back. How optimistic are you that they'll come to an agreement at this point?
Well, there is a little bit of a cycle here of talks, hiatus, and then more sanctions, talks, hiatus, and then more sanctions. And we've seen a repeat of this cycle 6, 7, 8 times. Are we nearing the end of this process, or are we in the middle of the process? And I think it's very difficult to say. These tariffs will have a severe impact for many people, including sporting goods and apparel and other consumer goods, such as toys. So while some sectors have been temporarily let off the hook, others are looking at a much more immediate effect, and this will have an effect on the economy.
So, Sarah, walk us through what's on the list, what's not on the list. Of course, some products still getting hit by tariffs on September 1st, and then a new raft of products in December. You've got some Apple products on both lists. What stands out?
Absolutely. So I think it is as an example of the uncertainty and the chaos that these kind of announcements cause. You know, for a company like Apple, let's say the AirPods are on the list for September 1st, but the Apple iPhones for December 15th. And so, you know, we've heard from companies that said this even in itself, having some products on the first list and others on the second, sort of it messes with their planning. They've already told, you know, their clients, the people that they sell to, that the prices are going to go up, and now they have to plan for something slightly different, even if it's a temporary reprieve. So, you know, some of the items on the September 1st list include a lot of more agriculture products. There's still some footwear. Some retail items are on that The December 15th list is really interesting because it's more your holiday shopping, Black Friday, Cyber Monday type of items, things like TVs and cell phones. So, Trump even acknowledged today that there would be a hit if those tariffs took effect on consumers going into the holiday season. So that was some of the thinking behind the delay as well.
Now, Craig, well, as you mentioned, while it's difficult to say what's going to happen in the short term, in the long term, there's discussion about whether or not this is the beginning of a new normal, no matter how these talks play out. What do you think?
Well, I think that we have to remember the beginning of the dispute, which was over the 301 sanctions imposed by the United States Trade Representative on intellectual property rights, market access, cyber, forced technology transfer, and market access. Those are issues that can be solved. So if we go to the core of the problem, if we remember the cause belli, the original source of our original objectives, those can be resolved. And we are hopeful that there is a resolution of those important issues in the near term, because there are many other issues piling up on top of this, both in the trade, in the technology, and in the national security area. And until we get some agreements at a relatively more simple space of trade, those larger issues are going to become more difficult to resolve.
So near term, Sarah, as I understand it, the next step that we know of is a phone call between the two sides in 2 weeks. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think, it can't be stressed enough that today's announcement, there's no sign, there's no indication that it means the two sides are any closer to a deal. So we do know that they are going to speak again in 2 weeks. There were talks scheduled to happen in early September. We didn't have a date on that yet. But, the Chinese were supposed to come to Washington. We haven't heard that those are canceled. If those move forward, of course, there are more chances for progress. And so, if the December 15th date comes and the two sides have come up with some agreement, there's a chance that those tariffs again can be delayed or not put into place. So there's a wider window now, I suppose, for the talks to take place. But there's really no indication today that, because of discussions that they recently had, that anyone's closer to a deal on these really big issues like addressing IP theft, or even that the Trump administration's any closer to removing the tariffs that have been put in place that China's really advocating for.
All right, Bloomberg's Sarah McGregor, I know you will keep us posted every step of the way. Thank you, Craig. I want you to stick with me. We're going to switch gears now to Hong Kong, where protesters at the Hong Kong International Airport, one of the busiest global hubs in the world, brought it to a standstill Tuesday for the second day this week. Dozens of flights canceled, and the chaos escalating, as you see there, as police officers began confronting and arresting demonstrators. A lot of complicated micro situations in this chaos. Craig, first of all, what is your reaction to just how quickly this has escalated just in the last 48 hours and the impact on the global business and tech community? Many companies obviously have hubs there, and a lot of travelers coming in and out.
Well, I am very concerned that Beijing has started to use the word terrorism to describe the situation in Hong Kong. That word has great meaning, and it portends a change in the Hong Kong situation if this continues. So I am hopeful that the demonstrators understand the import of that word, and that there is a bit of a backing off. At this stage, the last thing that we need is more violence, and indeed, Hong Kong's status as an entrepot and a center of Asian commerce and culture is at risk.
Now, there's been violence allegedly on both sides. There was a video widely circulated on Twitter of a Chinese police officer who was trying to confront a protester. The baton was stolen, and protesters started hitting the officer with the baton. On the other hand, there are reports of officers dressed as protesters, then trying to apprehend protesters. What's your take on the Chinese government's reaction to this so far? You've got security forces doing demonstrations in Shenzhen, just across the border, but at the same time, certainly hasn't escalated to broad-scale violence?
Right. So I think that the designation or the use of the word terrorism is indeed a step change, and it worries me greatly that provides an excuse for the PLA or for others in the Chinese government to go in. If there is quote-unquote terrorism in Hong Kong, clearly Beijing would be concerned. I think most would argue that this is not terrorism. It is a riot, but Beijing is clearly going up an escalatory ladder here, and I hope that the violence stops before acts are committed that cannot be taken back and change Hong Kong's status forever.
Meantime, President Trump tweeted earlier, "Our intelligence has informed us that the Chinese government is moving troops to the border with Hong Kong. Everyone should be calm and safe." Now, it's unclear what information exactly the president has, if any, but what do you make of President Trump's response here, given the complicated dynamics of what's happening between the U.S. and China, that he is, in many cases, initiating, and how it's impacting U.S. business and tech companies and impacting U.S. consumers?
Well, the U.S.-China relationship is incredibly complex. I think that the president's use of the word riot, which is the same word that the Chinese have been using, indicates a degree of empathy with Beijing, and that the president understands that this is a situation that needs to calm down. The violence does need to stop. So the U.S.-China bilateral relationship has multiple tension points, multiple tensions and fragmentation points, and it is there is a great deal of conflict here. Let us hope that the PLA stays out of Hong Kong so as not to add to that tension, and that the violence subsides as quickly as possible. We should be looking for a peaceful way out of this situation rather than further escalatory actions on either side.
All right. Well, we're going to continue to follow this situation as it evolves. Craig Allen of the U.S. China Business Council, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Meantime, the SEC has dealt another blow to those in the cryptocurrency community. Regulators again delaying a decision on approving 2 Bitcoin exchange-traded funds. SEC Chair Jay Clayton has said concern over the lack of investor protection makes it unlikely the funds will be approved anytime soon. Coming up, a Bloomberg Scoop, Facebook has been paying hundreds of outside contractors to transcribe clips of audio from its users. We'll have the details next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio, listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. Now to a Bloomberg Scoop. Facebook has been paying hundreds of outside contractors to transcribe clips of audio from its users. The work has rattled these contract employees who were not told where the audio was recorded, how it was obtained, only to transcribe it. Facebook isn't the only big tech company to come under fire for collecting audio snippets from consumer computing devices. Apple, Amazon, and Google have also been in the hot seat. Let's bring in Bloomberg tech reporter Sarah Fryer, who broke this story. So first of all, say what?
So this is an instance of, it's really intense right now because a lot of people have heard Facebook come out and say that they do not listen to their users' conversations. They're not listening to you on your phone, etc. However, there is a subset of Facebook users who use the transcription service on their Facebook Messenger chats. So say if I send you a voice memo, you would have an option to transcribe that memo.
Okay.
What Facebook has done is, in order to make sure that the AI is transcribing that correctly, they've also sent those clips to these hundreds of outside contractors who are listening to these people's conversations and judging their human transcriptions against the AI.
But you're also reporting that it's not just to determine the accuracy of the conversation, but also if the conversation are violating standards.
Well, it's unclear about why. The contractors are not told why, but Facebook seems to put this in the same bucket. They said that, yes, they have been doing this. They confirmed our scoop. But they put in the same bucket as what Google and Apple and Amazon have done in trying to use humans to make the AI more functional. Now, when you ask Facebook to transcribe your messages, you're probably not expecting that there is an actual person that is looking at these messages and trying to transcribe them. This is done anonymously, but still, these are your private conversations. It's kind of the same as if you have a voice message on your phone that gets transcribed automatically by your phone provider. It's like that. You see that. It's obviously from a bot. There's a lot of errors. And they're trying to make that higher quality by using these humans to make it better. But it just runs afoul of everything everyone expects to be happening.
How would you differentiate between what Facebook is doing here and what Apple and Amazon and Google have also been accused of?
Apple, Google, and Amazon are all doing what they're doing for the voice assistants. So if you say, hey Alexa, or okay Google, that's when they start recording your voice to get the command that you're in that instance, you are communicating with the company, right? Mm-hmm. You're saying, hey Alexa, what's the weather today? Or okay Google, set a timer for 30 minutes. This is people talking to each other. This is me saying, Emily, do you mind, calling this source on my behalf because I think that you have a better relationship with them. Mm-hmm. And then somebody would be able to see that. And so I do think that it crosses a different kind of line than these other relationships we've known about.
That said, Facebook, as you said, putting itself in the same boat as Apple and Google, saying much like Apple and Google, we paused human review of audio more than a week ago. So they've said they've stopped this now, a week before your story broke, which sounds kind of convenient. But what do you make of their reaction in the midst of everything else that is going on with Facebook, and on top of that, not having transparency with the workers who are doing this about why exactly they're doing that?
So that's one mistake, right?
And does that lack of transparency indicate that Facebook knew there was something untoward
well, absolutely.
about
the
this?
Contractors who have spoken to me are very concerned that this is an ethical violation, because if you look at the Facebook data use policy, it says nothing about audio. It says, we're going to look at your communications, try to make them better, try to give you the right news feed, ordering, try to serve you the right ads, but it doesn't say, there might be people transcribing your audio. Now, on the flip side, we are in a different place right now with Facebook than these other companies. Facebook just came off a $5 billion settlement with the FTC that said they wouldn't do anything without explicit user consent, and they have tried to turn over a new leaf in their relationship with users and develop trust back to where it was. My sources tell me that this program to transcribe what these messenger people are saying to each other, this is a recent program. It started in the last few weeks. And so even though they stopped it recently, it's also something that they started even after Amazon was getting critiqued.
Oy. Okay, Sarah Frier, thank you. I know you're going to continue to pull that thread there. Thank you for that great scoop from you today. Bloomberg, Sarah Frier. Coming up, in a long-awaited merger, CBS and Viacom finally announced its $11.7 billion deal. We've got all the details on the stock deal next. And we're live streaming on Twitter. Find us there at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. In long-awaited deal news, CBS agreed to merge with Viacom in an $11.7 billion transaction. The all-stock deal unites the most-watched U.S. broadcast network with the parent of Paramount Pictures and cable channels like MTV and Nickelodeon. It followed a marathon negotiation session this week as the two sides hashed out a price for the long-awaited merger. To discuss, we're joined by Bloomberg's Lucas Shaw. So, Lucas, what was it? What clinched the deal?
I think they finally realized that after 2-3 years of going back and forth, that whatever misgivings they might have had about what assets Viacom had, what assets CBS had, who's going to be in leadership, that they both just needed to get bigger so that they could compete in this streaming war that we're all setting about. Over the past few years, We have seen AT&T buy Time Warner, or perhaps you could say Time Warner sell out to AT&T. We've seen Fox and the Murdochs sell a lot of their assets to Disney. And now most of the companies that are playing in media and entertainment are companies that are worth $100 billion, $200 billion. If you count companies like Apple and Amazon, $800 billion, $900 billion. CBS and Viacom are minnows compared to that. Even combined, they're worth only about $30 billion. But by coming together, they get to take a deep library of movies and TV shows and funnel those into streaming services that they're already selling, but will get much stronger with the deep library of shows.
So how does this position this now combined entity against all of the other newly merged, now larger media companies?
You know, it's still small in comparison. And most analysts that you speak to, most investors believe that there are probably more deals to be made. I spoke with Bob Bakish earlier today. He's going to be the CEO of the combined company. He acknowledged that more M&A is likely. Now, it's not clear if that's going to make them a buyer or a seller. They could go out. They have been linked at various points to companies like Lionsgate and Discovery. And it's possible that they may try to buy one of them or merge with one of them. It's also possible that the Redstone family, which is going to control the combined company, will decide that now is the time to cash out. Now that you've taken a couple of assets that were seen as maybe a little weak, put them together, it's stronger, and it might be able to entice some larger company to come in and scoop it up.
Now, just in a nutshell, take us on a little trip down memory lane and how hard it was to get to this point for these two sides.
Well, look, this dates back to when Sumner Redstone, who's the patriarch of the Redstone family, was still very much in control. He decided to split them more than a decade ago, believing that doing so would unlock a lot of value for Viacom, which owned MTV, Nickelodeon. This is at a time where the cable TV business is booming. And he thinks that CBS, which has its CBS broadcast network and the Showtime premium cable network, was kind of dragging Viacom down. Then YouTube, Netflix, Viacom all of a sudden looks like the weaker party. Sumner gets old, incapacitated. How involved he was in the next decision-making is still a matter of much dispute. But what we do know is that Sherry Redstone, his daughter, thought that it would be better for the companies to get back together. But she had a really hard time convincing the executives of both companies to let her have a say. First, she fought for control of Viacom with Philippe Dauman. She wins that battle. She ends up installing Bob Bakish as the CEO of that company. Then she tries to get Les Moonves, who's the CEO of CBS, to merge the two companies, let him run it. He resists, but then he ends up having to leave the job because he's accused of sexual harassment by at least a dozen women. And then finally, 2-3 years after the first discussion of putting them back together again, we have an agreement to do it, and not without a lot of fighting and hand-dragging miles along the way.
All right. Boy, sounds like a Lifetime movie or a new original show. Bloomberg's Lucas Schott, thanks so much for all those twists and turns. Coming up, stopping the spread of online extremism. We're going to speak to one guest who has a plan for what tech companies need to do next. This is Bloomberg. Technology, I'm Emily Chang. Now to a topic we are continuing to follow, the rise of online hate speech and extremism. The owner of 8chan defended his site after incorrect media reports claimed the suspected perpetrator of a Saturday terror attack in Norway had posted to the site just hours before. Jim Watkins responded in a YouTube video saying, quote, "The website has been offline voluntarily for the last week. I want them to understand that we have nothing to do with this crazy violence that has been happening." To discuss in Washington, we've got Joshua Geltzer, Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law, and in Washington as well, Bloomberg's Ben Brody, who covers tech's corporate influence in the Capitol. So, Ben, obviously there's been a lot of agitation around gun laws and what to do about gun legislation in the midst of this spate of violence, but also a new campaign among lawmakers about fighting online extremism. What is the latest?
Well, the problem is that there is not necessarily a lot that lawmakers can force the companies to do. So you had companies like Twitter coming to the White House last week and supposedly having a conversation about this sort of online extremism. But what sort of came away with it is we're going to work harder with federal agencies and we're going to trade information better. This is something that has been ongoing really for several years now. And in some ways, we've run up to the limits of those kinds of cooperations, and it's not necessarily stopping these kinds of attacks. So what you get then is lawmakers looking to other kinds of things. Do you need to look at platform liability? Do you need to force these companies to take down gun sales? Those would involve legal changes, but it's certainly something that folks are looking at here in Washington.
Now, Joshua, the problem is that even if a site is down, you've got, potential perpetrators going to other sites, whether it's 8chan or 16chan or another one that came up in connection to this Oslo attack, N-chan, where an alleged potential gunman posted not a manifesto, but a link to a Facebook stream. How do you even begin to combat this?
It's hard, but I do think there's progress when you push hate, and especially the sort of hate speech that contributes to violence, into places where fewer people see it. So yes, as bigger platforms, then medium-sized platforms, and even smaller platforms do a better job, we hope, over time, of policing their sites, of enforcing their terms of service, of keeping this material off those sites, it does show up elsewhere. But ultimately, if it shows up in places where there are fewer people seeing it, fewer people reading it, and ideally fewer people responding to it with violence in the real world, that still strikes me as progress overall.
Now, Ben, the owner of 8chan says he's deliberately keeping this site offline for now. We also know that Cloudflare, one of its service providers, also stopped working with 8chan, which also could have kept the site down. In that YouTube video that he posted, the 8chan owner says that he's going to be talking with Homeland Security. Has he been called to testify? What do we know about that process?
Right. So the House Homeland Security Committee, the chairman, Benny Thompson, a congressman from Mississippi, and then the top Republican, Mike Rogers, they have said that they want him to come in and discuss with them. They did not say whether that was going to be public testimony or whether that was going to be a conversation with staff, but it would be a continuation of efforts that this committee has been engaging in for the last several months, especially as they look at the rise of online domestic terrorism and white nationalist terrorism here in the United States. They had Facebook and Twitter and other companies in the last couple of months, and so now they're going to be pushing forward on that. And when we talked to Chairman Thompson about that a couple months ago, what he said is, hey, we're not sure exactly where there's going to go. There are First Amendment concerns here, but we can't simply let this proliferate, even if the solution is just putting pressure on the companies to do more internally. We just can't let this keep going.
Joshua, you recently wrote a piece on Lawfare with a sort of 5-step process to be taken by tech companies. Walk us through that process in a nutshell.
So it begins with opening channels between the government and the tech sector, as well as within the tech sector, to share information better, faster, more effectively on these issues. Those channels have been open now, as Ben indicated earlier, but they've really been focused on international terrorism, content linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and groups like that. Clearly, events are showing that that's not the only source of terrorist threats to Americans on U.S. soil. So there needs to be a more fulsome exchange of information about these types of threats, the type that often get called domestic terrorism. There also needs to be a strengthening by the companies of how they approach this issue. And that's where there's a bit of a political trap, because companies, in my view, should do more to take down not just graphic violence itself, but the sort of hate-filled rhetoric that seems to contribute to fuel even violence in the real world. But here, if they turn up their ability to take down, if they ramp up their algorithms to take down the sort of messaging that's anti-immigrant, that's otherwise far right-wing, they will automatically at least take down some rhetoric from those on the very far right. And that's exactly what they were taken to task for by this same White House just a few weeks before Friday's summit. So it's a bit of a political trap, but it's also where we need to go if we're going to protect people from the sort of violence we've been seeing.
Meantime, Josh, rumors have been flying about the death of billionaire and alleged sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, which, by the way, news of that broke on 4chan 40 minutes before it even hit mainstream media, which just goes to show how powerful some of these even fringe sites are. Now you've got, on social media, even the president of the United States retweeting conspiracy theories about how Epstein was killed. How do you combat this stuff when you have also this sort of noise in the background at the highest levels of the U.S. government?
It makes it so hard for people in government to try to tackle these issues. And of course, there are well-intentioned people working hard in government to try to do just that. But ultimately, if the commander-in-chief is contributing to the problem rather than helping to solve it, that undermines credibility with tech companies, that undermines credibility with foreign partners, and it just plain old aggravates the problem. That being said, there are those who continue to have credibility in this country with the public and with the tech sector. And for them to try to have a conversation that almost puts the president to the side, that seems urgent. It also raises the stakes for who this president will nominate as a full-time, not just acting, director of national intelligence, because these are among the issues that a DNI in the modern era needs to think hard about. And to have somebody who will be a straight shooter rather than somebody contributing to the noise, that's critical.
All right, Joshua Geltzer of Georgetown Law, Bloomberg's Ben Brody. So much to continue discussing. Thank you both. Coming up, Argentina is moving toward yet another economic crisis after this weekend's election. How this will impact the country's growing tech industry next. This is Bloomberg. Argentina assets extended losses Tuesday following the weekend's shocking primary election defeat for President Mauricio Macri. The peso slid another 7% Tuesday after hitting a record low against the U.S. dollar in Monday's session. The results set off a shockwave in financial markets, with Argentina's stock market plunging as much as 48% in the second biggest one-day rout globally since 1950. But what does this mean for Argentina's burgeoning tech sector? Joining us on Skype from Italy to discuss, Startup Buenos Aires founder Lisa Besserman. Startup Buenos Aires aims to connect and support startups and entrepreneurship in Buenos Aires. And despite the fact that you are right now, Lisa, in Italy, first of all, what kind of an impact do you expect this to have on the tech ecosystem there?
Well, it is a very big challenge. There's a lot of uncertainty happening in Argentina at the moment, especially when it deals with foreign investment. That is a very huge component in the success of startups and entrepreneurs in Argentina. And right now, we don't know what's going on. I mean, as you mentioned, the local stock market plummeted, the peso devalued by 30%, inflation's at an all-time high, about 55%. So right now, it is a very ominous time in Argentina. I'd like to say I'm cautiously optimistic that we can continue with the current administration, because this administration has been enacting a lot of policies and initiatives and programs to support entrepreneurship in Argentina.
What kind of policies have supported the tech sector in Argentina thus far?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, there was something called the Ley de Emprendedores, which is the entrepreneur law, which enabled entrepreneurs to start companies earlier. It created crowdfunding opportunities. It created tax breaks for investors. And it was really a very huge step forward in terms of how the government is going to work and bet on entrepreneurs to help increase and improve the local economy. That, in addition to quite a few different programs. Incubate is a local public incubator program which invests between 10 and 30,000 equivalent equity-free money to startups and entrepreneurs. There's something called Via Emprende, which is an educational program. So there's lots of different policies and programs and initiatives that have aimed to serve the entrepreneurial market, because President Macri knows that it's entrepreneurs that can save Argentina.
So what happens if these policies do not remain in place, or that they are upset as well?
I think what we need right now is policy continuity in order to avoid any sort of a macroeconomic crisis. And I think we're all hoping that the current administration does stay on course, and that we do remain, a country that is looking towards being a part of the global capital markets. If that doesn't happen, then it's going to be a big challenge for Argentina, for the future of Argentina, for the future of its economy. We could be potentially facing another crisis like what happened in 2001, and it's not just going to be an economic crisis, it's going to be a cultural crisis.
Meantime, talk to us about the startups that have thrived, the kinds of companies that have thrived there thus far. You've got an emerging fintech, ag tech sector, crypto. Tell us more.
Sure. Yeah. Necessity breeds innovation, and anybody can tell you that the banking industry and the fintech industry in Argentina, with a centralized government, it's challenging. So there have been a lot of really successful fintech startups that have emerged from the region. Cryptocurrency, Argentines were one of the first to adopt the Bitcoin. There are tons of startups that are focusing on cryptocurrency for decentralized, monetary reasons. And ag tech, also a lot of software development is coming out of the region. We see a lot of software development firms and companies that we're creating a new outsourcing hub for offshoring technology services and the labor force, because it is so highly recognized. And even the Harvard Business Review ranked Argentina as #1 in technology skills globally.
All right. Well, we'll continue to follow the situation as it unfolds there. Lisa Besserman, Startup Buenos Aires founder, thank you so much for joining us. Meantime, Snap has unveiled the third version of its video recording sunglasses. Spectacles 3 will allow users to record with 2 cameras instead of 1. They're also more than twice as expensive as the previous model, $380 a pair. Snap hasn't had much success with glasses so far. It overestimated demand and had to write down almost $40 million in inventory in its earlier versions of glasses in 2017. Still ahead, WeWork anticipation stirring, poised to file its public prospectus for its IPO this week. We talk about how much WeWork is worth as we wait. This is Bloomberg. In sports, Seattle Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson and Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella are among those who've bought a stake in Seattle's Major League Soccer team. That fends off interest from suitors in California. They acquired the stake owned by Hollywood producer Joe Roth. And we continue to wait for WeWork's prospectus for its IPO, which could come as early as this week. This would hold the full financial picture of the office-sharing startup for the first time. The company said in April it had filed paperwork for the initial public offering confidentially with the U.S. SEC. To discuss, we are joined by Phil Hazlitt, EquityZen co-founder in New York. EquityZen is an online marketplace for trading in pre-IPO employee shares from privately held companies. So, Phil, what are you going to be looking for when this crosses?
Sure. Hey, Emily. I'm going to be looking for 2 things. I think one is I'll be looking for the SoftBank ownership stake in the S1, because I think a lot of people are really curious of what SoftBank's ownership stake really looks like. And the second part I'm going to be looking at is non-GAAP financials, which is kind of a euphemism for fuzzy math that WeWork has tended to use to kind of describe its financial health. So those are going to be the 2 areas I'm going to be focusing on.
What kind of fuzzy math has been of concern when it comes to WeWork?
Sure. I think the one we've heard about a few times is community EBITDA, which is a relatively new idea that WeWork has used to kind of show what their unit economics are for each of the buildings that they run. But it doesn't take into account a lot of the costs and expenses that come with running a real estate company. So I think that's one example that investors are going to be focused on, because it's not really anything they can compare to another traditional technology company.
How popular have WeWork shares been on the secondary market?
It's really interesting you say that. So at EquityZen, we've worked with about 150 companies to date, and I can say that actually, despite the brand awareness for WeWork publicly, in the private markets, we've actually seen relatively tepid demand for the company, which may hint that the valuation for the company is a little bit higher than investors are looking for, and may not bode as well for the company as it becomes a public entity.
So how does it compare to other names that we might know?
Sure. So, we saw pretty active markets in companies like Spotify and Slack leading up to their IPOs, which kind of makes sense because both of them have pretty high awareness even while they're private. And we would have expected to see something similar for WeWork, but it's been a little bit more tepid, as I mentioned, which is kind of interesting because the founder himself, Adam Neumann, has actually sold off, I think, something like $700 million worth of shares as a founder, which I think is going to be one question that he's going to have to answer over and over again at some of these investor days before the IPO.
How much concerns do you think there are about governance in general? Of course, it's been an issue with several, companies that have recently gone public about founder control, whether founders have taken money off the table before the IPO. But this one in particular definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah. If I had more than two eyebrows, I'd raise all of them. That's what's really happening here with WeWork. You've got an Up-C structure, which is basically an opportunity for the founders and some of the earlier investors to get a 7% haircut on their taxes, but it's pretty rare out there. That's actually going to prevent the company from being in the S&P 500 for years to come. You've got a founder selling a lot of liquidity pre-IPO. You've got also a bit of a narrative change for the company between now and when it's and maybe 8 or 9 months ago. If you kind of recall back in December or January, the company was planning to raise something like $8 or $10 billion from SoftBank. That ended up becoming $1 billion from SoftBank. So I think that is also going to invite some more questions. But what we haven't seen yet, and what we'll look for in the S1, is if the company decides to have a very founder-heavy voting structure, something that we've seen in recent IPOs where the founders effectively kind of control the future of the company, while retail investors have, a piddling 1 vote per share compared to the founders.
There's also been a sort of change in the business model and the company experimenting with different lines of business that may not be as well understood as the core business.
That's right. I think 2 areas to focus on. One, WeWork has expanded from just catering smaller businesses and startups and moved up the chain more to enterprise offerings. So they've worked with companies like JP Morgan, Bank of America, larger kind of conglomerates, and building out more of an enterprise offering. The benefit to investors to see that is that they probably have locked them into longer term leases, and there's a little bit less variance there. The second part is also that the company has made, I think, 3 acquisitions in the past year or two, one as recently as last week, to kind of really bolster their technology offering. And one way I kind of think about WeWork as a technology company is trying to kind of solve the kind of the office admin function that you might have as a business, and to try to kind of take that away from you to save you a lot of money. And I think they're really focusing investors on that area, which they kind of have to, because right now at a company valued at $47 billion and 26 times their last 12 months revenue, you better have a pretty darn good story on why you're being valued at such a large multiple relative to a lot of other real estate comps that historically trade somewhere between 0.5 to 1.5 times revenue instead.
Indeed. All right. Well, we're watching for that S1. We'll, of course, have all the headlines as that crosses. Phil Hazlitt, Equities and co-founder. Thanks so much for sharing that insight there. I want to return now to Apple, the smartphone maker, getting a nice reprieve from U.S. China trade tensions. Apple shares soaring Tuesday after the Trump administration delayed the next round of tariffs until mid-September, including a 10% levy on mobile phones and laptops. Apple has said the tariff will affect all of its major products in China, made in China, that is, including iPhones, iPads, Macs. Joining us from LA to discuss, Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. And Mark, it's a little bit complicated. There are a number of Apple's products still going to be tariffed on September 1st, and several that have also been delayed until December 15th, if indeed those tariffs go into effect. Walk us through the 2 lists.
Right, so like you said, there are 2 sets of lists. The big one is December 15th. That's when the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod Touch, the MacBook Pro, products like that, that's when they are planned to get hit. Now, you might want to know, why is that such a big deal that that's happening December 15th instead of September 1st? Well, right now it's in mid-August, so we're about a month away from the next iPhone launching, and about 2 months away from the next MacBook Pro, the 16-inch MacBook Pro they've been working on, and upgrades to the iPad Pro as well. Now, those 3 product lines are some of the most profitable and highest revenue-generating products for Apple. The iPhone last year, even though they've been shifting a lot to services, still makes up almost half of the company's revenues. And new iPhone season is when a lot of these phones are sold annually. So they're going to get a nice 10% reprieve on that for at least the initial 2-month period of the new iPhones and iPads going on sale. The other list, these are some of Apple's lower selling products, the ones that are very interesting. People are talking a lot about them, but quite frankly, they don't make Apple as much money as the other products, and that's the AirPods, the Apple Watch, the HomePod, and some things like battery cases and Apple Watch bands and iMacs.
So do we know how much of the tariff is going to be passed on to the consumer? For example, how much will this increase the price of, let's say in the short term, the AirPods and the Apple Watch, and potentially in 4 months, the iPhone?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about tariffs and what the impact is going to be on consumers, the impact on Apple for months now. But, you know, my thinking is that the impact already happened, right? I think Apple saw this coming. There's been discussions about this for the past 2 years or so with the Trump administration. And you look at that big price hike they made to the iPhone 10 a couple of years ago to $1,000. You look at how high the storage prices are bringing up the cost of the iPhone XS and XS Max last year. You look at the $200 price increase they did on the iPad Pro last year. You look at the additional Apple Watch models. You look at the premium you have to pay for the new AirPods if you get the wireless charging case, right? So my take is that these price increases, whoever it's going to be impacted on, has already been built into the price, and consumers have been paying for it already for the last year.
So this run-up in Apple shares, could this be just another short-term bump? I mean, we have no idea near-term what's going to happen with the trade talks. It's almost more certainty that over the longer term, this is a new normal between the U.S. and China.
You know, I would say if we were talking about January, February right now for the reprieve moving, you know, let's say they were supposed to go into effect January and they moved it to March, investors would be overreacting. I mean, we saw an 8% jump in the stock price today. But that move from September 1st to mid-December, specifically for the iPhone, the iPad, and the MacBook lines, that's very significant because a lot of new phones are going to be sold between, you know, September 21st, December 22nd, when the new phones are likely to go on sale, and that holiday quarter, right? December 15th is pretty much the end point of when people are going to shell out, you know, a ton of money for holiday gifts, Hanukkah gifts, Christmas gifts.
Right.
So that period is really important for Apple.
Okay, Bloomberg's Mark Gurman all over Apple for us. As always, thanks so much, Mark. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We're live streaming on Twitter. Find us there at Technology. Follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter as well. This is Bloomberg.